I'd like to explore with you for a few moments what it means to respond to the issues that we've been talking about for the last hour so intensely. I'm going to suggest there's 4 ways that those of us who are moved, passionate, involved, concerned, can respond. The first way is you set up a charity. Good idea. You get yourself elected to Parliament. You pass legislation. You commission reports. You do a whole bunch of stuff to make stuff happen. I call that working for. The second way is that you organise. You bring people together. We heard about Haringey just now. You get people from different sectors of the community. You get the business community, you get the local authority, you get the civil society groups, you get faith groups together. And you get people themselves experiencing what Stephen so vividly described. And you get them all in a room together and you organise. And that's what I call working with. And the third thing you can do is you can actually sit down, as that teacher that Stephen described, you can sit down with a person just like the 10-year-old girl we've just seen. You can spend time with them, you can listen to them. That's what I call being with. And the fourth thing you can do is you can set up a blog site and you can denounce everybody for using the wrong vocabulary about this sector of the population. And you can source all sorts of information probably from other websites about how this government minister is actually corrupt and how this form of language is no longer appropriate in this day and age. I call that being for. You can probably tell from the way I've portrayed the 4 of them where my favourite lies. We need working for. We need working for in every aspect of it. Don't get me wrong, I like my dentist. I don't want to be my own dentist. I need someone to work for me to do things I can't do for myself. But it's one of the great principles that goes back to Saul Alinsky, if you know him, is never do for somebody something they can do for themselves. That actually diminishes them. And a response that assumes working for straight away is not necessarily a response that actually ever has a face-to-face encounter with a person at the centre of the issues we're talking about. And being for blogging or whatever it might be is just the same. You know all the right answers. You don't have to meet somebody at the centre of these issues to know all the right answers. I've got a problem with the word for. I don't have any problem with the word with. Working with and being with are a whole different kind of way of relating to these kinds of issues. I've got a huge amount of time for working with, for community organising, for empowering people, for taking energy from different sectors of society in a way that bonds different sectors of society together. But I've got all my time for being with. Because being with, building relationships, enjoying the reality of one another, seeing what they really are, not what they're not, that's actually what life is about. That's what we do with the people we love. That's what we will do, I believe, in eternity. We'll be with, there won't be problems to fix. We've got to find interesting ways to be with one another. Just as a sideline, as a footnote, as a Christian, as a pastor, and as a theologian, I'm quite interested in the percentages of how Jesus spent his life, his 33 years. He spent a week in Jerusalem working for us, saving us, whatever theological outlook you have. He spent 3 years in Galilee, being a community organizer, working with us. He spent 30 years in Nazareth, being with us. Now, we could say, well, of course, Jesus had no idea how to do an incarnation. He'd never done it before. God had no idea what God was doing with all of that. We know we would run an incarnation far better. But there's a little lack of humility there. I think those percentages are really interesting. 1% in Jerusalem, 9% working with, 90% being with. That's what inspires me. So how do you do the being with? That's what I want to spend the 10 or 12 minutes I've got left talking about. How do you do the being with? And of course what I'm going to say tonight is simplistic, because It's bound to be. But I want to challenge you tonight to go away from here and in the next week have a conversation of significance with a person from a very different place in society to yourself. And I think that might make you nervous, and so you might want to practice on somebody you know and trust, maybe somebody you came with tonight or somebody you're going to go back and see when you get home tonight. So just use them as the guinea pig. Practice on them. Maybe do it on the way home tonight or before you leave this building. Have this conversation. I've got 4 parts of this conversation. This is how the conversation starts. Tell me about the ways in which you're rich. Tell me about the ways in which you're poor. Let me tell you about the ways in which I'm poor. Let me tell you about the ways in which I'm rich. And the order's important. So you start by saying, tell me about the ways in which you're rich. Now just think about the accounts that we've heard tonight. Think about the things that Stephen said about the ways he was rich, although he was rather shy about saying it. And the person may say to you, I mean, I'm not suggesting you start this from scratch, but I've worked in soup kitchens in the States and here. And the easy thing is to do the working for, and you stand behind the counter and hand out the food. That's the easy part. The more interesting part is to sit down with people and actually have the real conversation. Because it's the isolation, as we've heard several times tonight, that most people are really struggling with. Okay, so you've built up a bit of a conversation. And then you say, do you mind if I ask you about the ways in which you're rich? And the person, let's just imagine, I'm making this up, but I'm making it up from conversations I've had. Let's just imagine the person then says, well, I expect you're probably going to talk about the fact that I grew up with no shoes. All the things we've heard tonight, that I grew up in a house that didn't have much fun. I expect you're... But actually, I'm rich because I can talk. Even since I was a tiny kid, I was the one in the class who was pushed to the front to tell the teacher that what the problem was, that we couldn't do the homework or whatever it was. And I seem to have found a way of talking with my whole body that energizes people and energizes me. And provided I'm in the right mood and I get the right kind of encouragement, I can really talk. Would you tell me about the ways in which you are poor? You're probably going to expect me to talk about the things that, all the visible ways in which you know that I'm poor and that I'm ashamed of. And I grew up being ashamed of. But actually, what makes me feel so poor is when I see people who are worse off than me and I don't have the resources to help them. When I see a newcomer, a migrant, come into this country and I can't speak their language so that I can really relate to them and really get alongside them, get to know them and see what they have to give me. Those are the ways I feel poor. Thank you. Now, can I tell you about the ways in which I feel poor? Well, I feel poor because I always grew up hating my brother. He was the talented one. He was the one that got all the attention. I was just the little girl. I seemed to get missed by my parents, by everybody. Even when I went to school, it was always, oh, you're so-and-so's brother. And, I still hate him, and I've never told him. My whole life has been consumed by envy. And I may look like I'm middle class and I've done okay, but my life has been crushed by envy. Can I tell you about the ways in which I'm rich? Well, you may think it's because I live in the suburbs and I've got this nice house and so on, but that's not really the way I feel rich. The way I feel rich is that I can really concentrate. I've always had this ability to really concentrate. I can concentrate for long periods of time. I can do a whole painting at one sitting. I can remember things. I've got this amazing memory. And, that can catch people out. And when I got into trouble legally, that was what got me out of trouble, because I could remember every single thing that happened on the night that I got into trouble. That's the way in which I'm rich. Now, that's what I've described, just the elements of what being with involves. And that's a conversation. And I encourage you to go away and have that conversation. But you may want to do a little bit more than that. You might want to have something that moves from a conversation to a relationship. And let me rather more briefly talk about what a relationship involves. It involves 4 more interactions. It moves from 4 to 8 because it takes a little bit more courage. And the bit more courage means saying, may I tell you about the ways in which I think you are rich? May I tell you about the ways in which I think you are poor? Will you tell me about the ways in which I am poor? Will you tell me about the ways in which I'm rich? You could probably have done that last one for yourselves, but you've got the hang of it by now. So how does that conversation go? Can I tell you about the ways in which you're rich? I know you've talked about talking with your whole body, but have you ever noticed? I've noticed just in the last hour we've been talking, children adore you. They will eat out of your hand. I know you think you're not much more than a child yourself, but children will do anything. You're a Pied Piper. You can tie little people around your little finger. That's an unbelievable gift. And why do they love you so much? It's because you talk with your body. You get so involved in a conversation. Can I tell you about the way in which you're poor? You're poor because you're so anxious. You're poor because you don't have a great self-esteem. You're poor because you're always worried, and maybe you picked that up from childhood, or maybe you picked that up from your mother and the situation she found herself in. That's the way in which you're poor. Will you tell me about the way in which I'm poor? I can see what you're saying. I can see what you're saying. You're saying that my relationship with my brother has eaten my life up. And you're right. Will you tell me about the ways in which I'm rich? Thank you. Thank you for telling me about the ways in which I'm rich. What you're saying is that I actually have such a longing and such a passion to see the world change, that it's actually a gift to me. And I can't not go out and do something about it. And whether that's a working for thing, like representing a constituency and passing legislation, or whether it's a working with thing, like organising community meetings and things like tonight, I've got to do it. I've got to get out there and do it. I've got that energy. That's what you're seeing in me. I actually believe the future can be bigger than the past. That's a whole conversation. And that's what being with means, because it means surprising people by starting by seeing their assets and not their deficits, their abundance and not their scarcity. I want to finish with just making a proposal to you. Poverty is the mask we put on people to hide their true wealth. Poverty is a mask we put on people to hide their true wealth. Wealth is a mask we put on people to hide their true poverty. The people we call poor are the people in whom we choose to see the deficits and not the assets. It becomes a convention. The people we call rich are the people in whom we choose to see only the assets, and we close our eyes to the deficits. And often we judge these assets and deficits in very narrow terms just by economic income, almost nothing else. But for me, at the pearly gates, economic income, it's not going to be one of the questions that's asked. It's going to be all the other rich and poor stuff we've just been talking about for the last quarter of an hour. Being with, to me, is our glimpse of eternity. I'm not saying that the issues the politicians have raised aren't fundamentally important. I'm not saying that the work that our wonderful teacher does isn't the most important work in the world. But I'm talking about you guys. I'm saying, how are you going to allow your life to be transformed To be somebody's friend is to say, I am allowing my life to be changed by knowing you. Who are you going to have this conversation with? Who are you going to say, I am allowing my life to be changed by knowing you? To whom are you going to be prepared to show your true poverty and to open your eyes to their real wealth? Thank you.